Fortune magazine did a study. I want to say now it's approximately 4 years old. In that study, what they found was that less than 20% of American corporations had done anything about workplace violence. They hadn't even done the relatively simple step of implementing a workplace violence policy. And again, that study is approximately 3-4 years old. And do I think that some companies probably have improved their record? Yes. Do I think it's a significant change? I do not. I ask in my talks very often, how many of you don't have a workplace violence policy? And many hands go up. I think a lot of organizations are underprepared for a couple of reasons. One, I think organizations and leaders, directors, administrators tell themselves, violence is random and unpredictable. As such, there's nothing you can do about it. You hope for the best. And I think believing that it's random and unpredictable, they figure, why bother? What can you really do? That's one. Two is, when they hear some of the things that experts recommend do, like implement a workplace violence policy, the thinking is, how does a policy stop someone from going on a rampage? And it doesn't, of course. What it does is 95% of the population will acquiesce to your expectations when you make your expectations clear. And so if 95% of a workplace do the right thing, at best, at worst, we have to focus on the 5% that haven't acquiesced. And that's a lot less work for HR professionals, security professionals. A workplace violence policy has to have several components. They're necessary and required for a real policy, for a tight policy. First, it has to be a zero tolerance policy. XYZ Corporation has a zero tolerance for workplace violence. Now, zero tolerance has gotten a bad rap recently. People have misinterpreted what that means. It doesn't mean that every time or any time you breach our policy, you'll be terminated. What it means is every breach of our policy will be investigated. That's important because our employees need to know they don't get a warning shot. They don't get one to burn. Next, our workplace violence policy has to state that all non-work-related weapons are strictly prohibited. We don't want weapons that have nothing to do with our business or our industry on our premises. Why? Because in the event that the hothead escalates towards violence and he has to get in his car and drive home to get his weapon, perhaps he'll cool down. Perhaps his wife will talk to him. Perhaps he'll hear something on the radio. He'll be reminded about his child, and he won't come back to work with that weapon, as opposed to going to his locker room and just going to his locker and grabbing his gun. Next, the workplace violence policy has to state that threats of violence are considered to be acts of violence. We do not want our employees coming to work under the threat of bodily harm. That's terrorism. And so our policy has to include those three components at a minimum. We are a zero tolerance organization. All non-work-related weapons are prohibited, and threats are to be considered acts of violence and will be dealt with just as severely as acts of violence.
One thing employers can do that's a very simple step is to implement a communication plan and to set up a team of affected members. You can include, for example, supervisors, whoever the receptionist is or the person running the front desk. You can include your security personnel as well. And those people you could charge with being the front line in your worksite security. Communication between those people and devising a method for rapid communication of information can achieve a far greater level of worksite security. And that's something that I see employers are capable of doing easily, and surprisingly a lot of employers aren't doing well enough. What I would give you as an example is an instance of domestic violence leading to violence in the workplace. There are statistics that suggest that domestic violence represents perhaps 6% of all instances of violence in the workplace. If an employee were to report to their supervisor that they were the victim of domestic violence, that supervisor, under a proposed communication plan, would be able to report, if the information provided to him were sufficient or appropriate enough to warrant it, that supervisor would report to all the other supervisors, to the front desk person or receptionist, to the security staff, the security guard in the building, the name and, if possible, a photograph of any person who presented a threat, in that instance, the spouse. If that spouse were to appear at the business site and had no business purpose for making that appearance. Under a proposed communication plan like the one I described, anyone who saw him first would also have not only the information that he's appearing at the work site and doesn't have a business purpose for the visit, but would also have enough information about the background of domestic violence and would be able to draw a logical conclusion that his presence there might present the potential for a threat of violence. If you don't have that communication piece, the supervisor passing in the hallway or the receptionist who first greets the spouse entering the workforce would have no reason to know that his or her presence was a potential security threat. And so communication and a communication plan where all people who are participating in the communication plan knew how to rapidly transmit information about threats can eliminate a large number of otherwise potentially avoidable instances of workplace violence. And the same goes with communication as between multiple employers that share a building or a strip mall or a shopping center, where a person might enter and rob one facility, may engage in a chain of events over the same day or over weeks at similar places that are similarly located. And when neighboring employers are able to transmit information more easily, I think that you also have an opportunity to avoid or minimize otherwise avoidable risks in workplace violence.